Isaac Stone steered his new dark blue Audi through a familiar route, savoring the feeling of hard work rewarded. The sleek car glided smoothly along the roads of an upscale neighborhood where Isaac had always dreamt of living. As a young lawyer with a promising career, Isaac had every reason to feel proud, yet that pride was fleeting. With one quick flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror, Isaac felt his world upended, teetering on the edge of something he couldn't fully predict. Behind him, Officer Jenna Lewis kept a steely gaze on Isaac's vehicle as her patrol car trailed him. Officer Lewis wasn't new to the area, nor was she a stranger to the people who lived here. She understood the rhythm of life here, a place where routine and expectation ruled. But despite her deep-rooted familiarity with this town, Isaac's presence, young, black, and confidently driving an expensive car, triggered something deeper within her. As she signaled for him to pull over, the usually quiet neighborhood seemed to tighten around them, drawing its collective breath. Isaac watched the flashing lights, his mind racing through a dozen scenarios in seconds. His heart hammered as he slowed his car and pulled it to the curb, doing his best to remain calm. Though his instincts told him to stay composed, a ripple of unease crept up his spine. He was no stranger to such encounters, but this time felt different, like something beyond his control was about to unfold. He had earned everything he owned, worked hard to be where he was, yet here he was, drawn into a situation that echoed a familiar, painful refrain. As Officer Lewis approached, Isaac could see her hand resting on her holster, her expression hard and unyielding. Each step she took seemed charged, layered with suspicion and purpose, as though she had already decided how this encounter would play out. When she finally reached the driver's side window, she rapped on it with a firmness that made Isaac's pulse race. He complied, lowering the window and offering a neutral, "Good evening, officer," his voice calm yet edged with tension. "License and registration," she demanded, her tone carrying a note that implied this was more than a simple check. Her eyes bore into him as if to unravel a hidden truth she felt certain was there. Isaac, with hands that moved carefully, retrieved his documents, passing them to her with an understated respect. The tension between them was almost tangible, thickened by the weight of their unspoken assumptions and unshared histories. She examined his information with a meticulousness that went beyond routine, her brow furrowed in concentrated skepticism. "This your car?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief as she sized him up, scrutinizing every detail of his appearance and his vehicle. "Yes, ma'am," he replied evenly, fighting to keep his voice steady, his words carefully measured. "I just got it last week." But his response did little to placate her suspicion. Instead, she directed him to step out of the car, her hand tightening around her holster. For a moment, Isaac felt his composure waver as an unsettling fear washed over him, blending with a simmering anger he knew he couldn't afford to show. Isaac took a measured breath, steadying himself before he spoke. "Officer, is there something specific I can help you with?" he inquired, his tone polite yet laced with the weight of his growing unease. Officer Lewis's posture stiffened as she responded sharply. "We've had reports of a vehicle matching this description, possibly stolen. Now, step out of the car." Her words landed like accusations, striking Isaac with a force that felt uncomfortably personal. Though anger surged within him, he reminded himself of the reality that any hint of frustration could worsen his situation. Isaac opened the car door slowly, his movements deliberate, knowing well that each gesture mattered. As he stepped out, he noticed a few people peeking from their windows, their faces illuminated by the glow of his car's headlights. The calm, respectable neighborhood he had chosen to live in now felt foreign and watchful, like the set of a tense stage play where he was the only actor, and the audience held its breath. He reminded himself to keep calm, to stay respectful, even though the situation gnawed at his pride and tested his patience. Officer Lewis circled him, her eyes sweeping over him with an air of suspicion. She motioned for him to spread his legs, her hands now moving methodically as she patted him down. Each touch was mechanical, impersonal, but with an underlying hostility that wasn't missed. As she searched him, her words were cutting, punctuated by a tone that carried assumptions. "Pretty nice car," she remarked with a hint of derision, "for someone like you." The words hit like a slap, stinging not just for their implications, but because they seemed to reduce everything Isaac had worked for into a stereotype. He swallowed back his indignation, knowing any emotional reaction could turn the scene in an unpredictable, dangerous direction. "Thank you, officer. I've worked hard for it," he replied, his voice unwavering, though he could feel the intensity of his heartbeat. The neighbors had now begun to congregate outside, their faces a mixture of concern, curiosity, and, to his disappointment, quiet judgment. Isaac had lived in this community for almost a year, greeting some of these very people with friendly nods and casual hellos. Now, he felt their stares, heavy with unspoken assumptions that felt like betrayals, echoing the unacknowledged boundaries he had hoped were left behind. The tension in the air only seemed to fuel Officer Lewis. As the audience grew, she appeared to double down on her stance, her voice growing louder as she addressed Isaac. "I'll need to see some more identification," she demanded, louder this time, as if performing for the onlookers. "Sir, I want to confirm exactly who you are." Isaac took another steadying breath, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. His instinct was to demand why, to stand his ground, but he knew how quickly the situation could spiral. He took his time before speaking, controlling his tone carefully. "Officer," he said, his words slow and calm, "I've already shown you my license and registration. They're both valid. I'd like to understand why I'm being detained." The gathering neighbors exchanged glances, whispers floating around him like a slow murmur. Some people shook their heads disapprovingly, perhaps wondering why he wasn't cooperating faster. Others stood in uncomfortable silence. Isaac felt the weight of every eye on him, judgment hanging heavy in the air, a silent verdict rendered without context. Officer Lewis, her hands still at the ready, didn't seem interested in explaining. Her gaze grew more steely as she sized him up once again. She took a step back, reaching for her radio with an unsettling precision. "We need additional support at my location," she announced, her voice cold and measured. "Possible hostile suspect." Isaac's eyes widened in disbelief. He had shown no hostility, kept his voice calm, yet here he was, being framed as a potential threat in his own neighborhood. A ripple of murmurs spread among the crowd, and Isaac could see the unease in their faces grow. The illusion of safety and familiarity in his own community was dissolving before his eyes, replaced by a sharp awareness that his presence was being recast, warped through a lens of bias. Even the neighbors he had thought friendly now appeared uncertain, casting wary glances between him and the officer, their expressions torn between concern for their own safety and a cautious curiosity about the unfolding scene. As he stood there, surrounded by his own neighbors and held captive by a police officer's suspicions, Isaac's mind raced. He scanned the familiar faces, Mr. Davis from 2 houses down, Mrs. Liu, who often walked her dog past his house, and the couple from across the street. Their faces, once welcoming, were now guarded, tinged with judgment. It stung, this silent verdict rendered without evidence, a painful reminder that in their eyes, he was still an outsider. In a moment of desperation, he locked eyes with Mrs. Liu, hoping for some signal of understanding. But her expression remained closed off, as though she too was uncertain of his place here. Just then, the approaching sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Isaac's heart sank further as a second police cruiser pulled up, casting flashing red and blue lights across the scene. 2 more officers emerged, both wearing grim, unreadable expressions as they took in the scene. With brisk efficiency, they positioned themselves on either side of him, creating an invisible barrier that felt less like protection and more like containment. The once quiet street was now alive with tension, every movement amplified, every word echoing in the charged silence. One of the new officers, Officer Ramirez, took a long look at Isaac, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Sir, put your hands where we can see them," he instructed, his voice controlled but firm. Isaac complied, raising his hands slowly, feeling the crushing weight of his own helplessness. The other officer, however, seemed to have a more aggressive stance, hand already on his holster, gaze sharp and unyielding as if waiting for any excuse to escalate the situation. Isaac's mind raced with conflicting emotions: fear, frustration, anger, and a deep, quiet sadness. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding over a car. It was a confrontation with the limitations and biases that had shadowed him all his life, even in places he thought he belonged. Officer Lewis took a step forward. Her demeanor hardened further, seemingly emboldened by the presence of her fellow officers. "We've received reports about a car similar to this involved in suspicious activities," she stated, her words directed more toward the crowd than toward Isaac himself, as if justifying her actions to the gathered onlookers. "We have reason to believe this could be a matter of public safety." Isaac felt a rush of frustration bubble to the surface, and for a moment, he considered voicing it. But he knew that any sign of impatience, any raised tone, could be used against him. "Officer," he replied, keeping his voice measured, "you have my documents, and I've answered all your questions. I'd like to call someone for assistance to ensure my rights are protected here." He chose his words carefully, though he could feel the frustration inching into his voice. As he reached into his pocket for his phone, the two officers tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward their holsters. "Hold it!" one of them barked. "Put the phone down. No one said you could make a call." Isaac's hand froze mid-air, the weight of the phone now feeling like a lead weight. The street, the faces, the flashing lights. It all blurred for a moment as he grasped the terrifying truth of the situation. He wasn't just being questioned. He was being treated as a threat, as though he had already been found guilty in a trial only Officer Lewis seemed to be conducting. The neighbors leaned in, their murmurs hushed but unmistakable. Some looked on with worry, others with quiet satisfaction, as if their suspicions were being confirmed simply by the officer's reactions. Isaac's pulse quickened, and he felt the urge to defend himself, to make them see the absurdity of it all. He wanted to shout out his innocence, to remind them that he was their neighbor, a young professional who had worked hard to earn his place here. But he knew that one wrong move could tip the situation into something far darker. In their eyes, he was already guilty, and there was no easy way to undo the suspicion that had taken root. As he glanced back at the officers, he noticed a slight hesitation in Officer Ramirez's face, as though he was beginning to question the necessity of the forceful approach. But the other officer, whose name tag read Thompson, seemed unwavering, his gaze fixed and cold. The sight of Isaac standing there, surrounded, hands raised, in a place that was supposed to be his sanctuary, only deepened Isaac's resolve. He had come this far, worked this hard, and he would not let this moment define him. But as Officer Lewis brought her hand up to her radio, calling for further backup, Isaac knew this was no longer just a matter of mistaken identity. It was a test of endurance, one that required every ounce of his strength. Isaac's hands remained raised, his fingers nearly trembling from the mix of frustration and fear surging through him. He watched as Officer Lewis, seemingly caught up in her own narrative, continued speaking into her radio. "I have a potentially dangerous suspect, requesting additional units for safety." The words sent a chill through him. Dangerous suspect. He hadn't resisted, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even made a sudden movement. Yet here he was, a young black man, boxed in by officers, as his neighbors, the very people he'd greeted on his morning jogs and waved to from his driveway, looked on as though he were a stranger, an outsider who didn't belong. Just then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was Mrs. Collins, the elderly woman who lived a few doors down. She stepped cautiously onto her porch, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her face marked by uncertainty. She had known Isaac since he moved in, yet her expression betrayed no hint of recognition. Instead, Her gaze lingered on him with a wariness that stung far deeper than words. Further down the street, Mr. Patel, usually friendly and quick with a wave, leaned against his porch railing, his face solemn, his expression unreadable. They had all seen him before, known him before. Yet now, in this tense, unforgiving light, they seemed to look at him as a stranger. Isaac's heart pounded as the silence stretched, interrupted only by the crackling of Officer Lewis's radio. For a moment, he felt utterly alone, standing in the very neighborhood he'd chosen for its promise of peace and acceptance. He had wanted so badly to be part of this community, to build a life here. But now, with every judgmental glance, every whisper floating in the cool evening air, he felt the cold distance widening between him and the people he had once hoped to call neighbors. Officer Thompson stepped closer, his eyes cold and unyielding, as if daring Isaac to make one wrong move. "We've had some serious issues in this area recently," he said, his voice heavy with implication. "You're driving a car that matches a description in a case we're working on. So we're going to be thorough here. Make sure everything's in order." The subtext in his words was clear, and it cut through Isaac's thin veneer of calm like a knife. They didn't see him as Isaac Stone, the lawyer, the hard worker, the neighbor. They saw him as a threat, a profile, a set of statistics that they were prepared to fit him into without a second thought. Isaac steadied his voice, knowing he couldn't afford to let his emotions spill over. "Officer, I've provided you with all my information. I've complied with every request," he said, his tone as measured as he could make it. "But I need you to understand that this is my neighborhood too. I live here, and I'm simply asking for the same respect you'd show anyone else." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Officer Lewis's gaze remained hard, her fingers still hovering near her holster. She didn't see him, not truly. She saw the echo of her own fears, her own biases, and each one of them played out in her stiff posture, her unyielding tone. The history she carried, the beliefs instilled in her over the years, seemed to drive her actions, reducing Isaac to nothing more than a figure in a story she believed she already understood. As the tension mounted, Officer Ramirez, who had been watching quietly, took a tentative step forward. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a hint of humanity that Isaac clung to. "Maybe we should take a moment to reassess," Ramirez said, his tone careful but softening. "I recognize this guy from the community center event last month. He volunteered there, spoke to the kids about his career. Doesn't seem like the profile we're looking for." Isaac felt a glimmer of hope, a lifeline amid the storm of hostility that surrounded him. He nodded, his voice steady, yet tinged with the urgency of someone who had finally found an advocate. "Yes, Officer Ramirez, that's right. I volunteer in the community. I'm a lawyer. I'm just trying to live a good life here." But as he spoke, Officer Lewis's expression hardened further, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on him with a simmering anger that went beyond professional duty. It was personal, driven by something deep and unyielding, an invisible force she carried with her. "I don't care if you're the mayor of this town," she spat, her voice low but fierce. "You fit the profile. This car fits the profile. And we're not just going to let you walk away because of a few nice words." The onlookers shifted uneasily, some muttering under their breath, while others continued to watch with a kind of morbid fascination. In that moment, Isaac felt the weight of his own helplessness pressing down on him, his heart aching not just from the injustice of the situation, but from the realization that, here and now, he was utterly alone. But then, something shifted in Officer Ramirez's face. He turned fully toward Officer Lewis, his gaze unyielding. "With all due respect, Jenna, maybe we're the ones who need to reconsider. Look at him. He's cooperated, he's calm, and his documents are valid. We're escalating this for no reason." A silence settled between them, a crack in the relentless tension, and for the first time, Isaac felt as if someone was finally seeing him. Not as a threat, not as a suspect, but as a person who deserved to be treated with the same decency and respect as anyone else. Officer Lewis, however, didn't move. Her fists clenched, her jaw tight with a fury that refused to dissipate. For Isaac, that moment felt like the tipping point. He realized that no amount of patience or compliance would change her perception of him. But perhaps, with Ramirez's intervention, there was still a chance to break through the wall of bias that had locked him in. With a calm but resolute voice, he met her gaze. "Officer Lewis," he said, his tone unshakable. "You've made assumptions about me based solely on how I look. But I'm not just going to stand here and be judged unfairly. You need to reassess what you're doing here, because this isn't justice. This is prejudice." The tension in the air thickened, the crowd murmuring as they absorbed his words. For Isaac, the outcome of this standoff was uncertain, but he was done staying silent. In that moment, he found his voice, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been judged, misjudged, and mistreated based on appearances alone. And as he stood there, resolute, he felt a surge of courage that no flashing lights or authoritative stares could take away. Officer Lewis's gaze was icy, her hand twitching slightly as she glanced between Isaac and Officer Ramirez. For a moment, it seemed she might push back, but Officer Ramirez's calm, unwavering expression held her in place. Tension hung thickly between them, the kind that couldn't be cut with words alone. The crowd, having watched the situation unfold with various shades of curiosity, suspicion, and silence, now shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Collins, who had been standing near the edge of the scene with her arms crossed, looked away, perhaps embarrassed by the unfolding reality. Mr. Patel folded his arms. His expression softened as he realized the weight of what was happening. The community's silent approval that had once emboldened Officer Lewis seemed to waver. Ramirez took a steadying breath, moving his attention back to Isaac with a nod of acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you." "Isaac," he said quietly, using his first name, a gesture that brought a flicker of dignity back into the exchange. "I'm going to check the car's registration once more to clear things up, and then you'll be free to go." But Officer Lewis wasn't ready to let go. Her voice, cold and unyielding, broke through the quiet. "This doesn't add up. His car, his profile, it all fits. We've been looking for someone who matches this description. I'm not just going to let this slide because he's cooperated." She spat the last word as if cooperation somehow lessened her authority. Isaac met her gaze steadily, feeling a mixture of anger and profound sadness. "You didn't even consider that you might be wrong," he said softly, each word deliberate. "You made up your mind about me before I even spoke." He looked to the crowd, his neighbors, allowing his words to carry not only to her, but to every watching face. "We live here together. We share this community. But moments like these show us how quickly assumptions can break the trust we try so hard to build." Mrs. Collins's face softened, and Mr. Patel looked down, a hint of shame coloring his expression. The gathered crowd, once quick to accept Officer Lewis's narrative, now seemed to shift uncomfortably. The weight of Isaac's words lay heavy over them, each person perhaps questioning their role in fostering a community that had, even if silently, allowed such bias to flourish. Finally, Ramirez turned to Officer Lewis, his voice firm. "Jenna, the plates are clean. There's no evidence, no reason to hold him any longer." Reluctantly, Lewis's hand fell from her holster. She looked at Isaac, her eyes flickering with a mix of frustration and something unspoken. A moment of reckoning, however brief, that even she couldn't escape. "Fine," she muttered, taking a step back. "You're free to go." The words were clipped, begrudging, yet Isaac felt a strange sense of victory. Not because he'd bested anyone, but because he'd stood his ground. Because his truth had managed to push through the fog of prejudice that had nearly obscured it. Isaac took a steady breath, his heart pounding with relief, but also a strange lingering sorrow. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, who had witnessed every moment, feeling a quiet resolve grow within him. "Thank you, Officer Ramirez," he said, his tone respectful but firm, before turning back to the community around him. "To everyone here, I'm your neighbor, your community member, and I hope you'll see me for who I am, not the assumptions attached to my appearance." He nodded respectfully to each face, then returned to his car, his spirit bruised but unbroken. As he slid into the driver's seat, Isaac glanced back one last time. In the silence that followed, he hoped that his words had planted a seed, one that could grow into understanding, even if slowly. Incidents like Isaac's highlight the importance of addressing implicit biases within our communities. Let's challenge our assumptions and commit to building neighborhoods where everyone is seen for their true self. We must be proactive, learn about bias, engage in open conversations, and stand up when we witness unfair treatment. Because real change begins with us, in our homes, our streets, and our communities. Together, we can build a world where everyone's humanity is recognized and respected. Let's take a step forward, share this story, start a conversation, and let's make our communities safer, more inclusive places for everyone.